My name is Beatrice Langley, and I'm 34 years old. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who writes her marriage into the internet like a confession. I'm an internal medicine physician at a mid-sized hospital in Phoenix, which means my life is measured in vitals, lab values, and the quiet lies people tell when they're afraid. Most weeks, I'm juggling 80 to 90 patients split between hospital rounds and outpatient clinic. It's exhausting in the way that seeps into your bones, but I've always believed the tiredness meant something, like I was earning my peace. And for a while, I had peace. My husband, Ethan, 35, used to joke that I could fall asleep standing up. He'd wrap his arms around me in our kitchen while I reheated leftovers at midnight and say, "One day, Dr. Langley, you're going to prescribe yourself a nap." I used to laugh. I used to believe the warmth in his voice meant safe. Now I replay those moments like surveillance footage, pausing on details I didn't understand at the time. The way his smile would hesitate when his phone buzzed. The way he'd tilt the screen away like it was instinct, not decision. And the worst part is, the whole thing started with one of my patients. His name is Victor Ramirez. Victor has been seeing me for about 8 months for HIV care. He was diagnosed 3 years ago, and medically, he's been doing everything right. Consistent meds, regular labs, responsible follow-up. For over a year, his viral load has been undetectable, which is the clinical word for controlled, for stable. Personality-wise, Victor always seemed fine. Not charming in a dangerous way. Not awkward either, just competent, polished. The kind of man who asks intelligent questions and looks you in the eye when you answer. He worked in marketing for a tech startup, dressed like he cared about impressions, and he was always punctual, early even. The type of patient doctors quietly appreciate because he doesn't make your day harder, which is why the moment felt so small at first, almost nothing. 2 weeks ago, Victor came in for his routine quarterly follow-up. Everything medically looked perfect. He was in a good mood. He even joked about how the lab techs knew his veins better than he did. I was updating his electronic health record when his phone, resting on the exam table, lit up with a notification sound, sharp enough to slice through the hum of the room. I glanced over without thinking. Not because I'm nosy, because I'm human and sounds make you look. The contact name was just one letter, E. And the message preview read, "Can't wait to see you tonight. Miss you already." It wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. There was intimacy in that sentence, a kind of certainty, the kind that assumes the recipient belongs to you. Victor's hand shot out like a reflex. He flipped the phone face down so fast the case clicked against the metal table. And then, this is the part that lodged under my skin, he looked at me with the expression of someone who'd been caught doing something he'd promised himself he wouldn't. Guilty, quick, controlled. He cleared his throat. "So, labs look good?" It was a hard pivot, too smooth, a curtain drop. "Your labs are excellent," I said, because professionalism is muscle memory. Undetectable, no concerns. Victor nodded, but he didn't relax. He didn't make one of his usual comments about dating or disclosure, which he'd always been careful about before. In previous visits, he'd ask questions about safe sex practices, disclosure protocols, the ethics of telling partners. I respected him for it. It told me he understood the seriousness of his condition beyond himself. So why the secrecy now? I told myself not to overthink it. Patients have complicated lives. Patients have reasons. My job isn't to judge their romance like it's a TV show. But then, last Tuesday night, I was on my couch watching a mindless Netflix series I couldn't name if you paid me. Ethan was curled beside me with his laptop open, catching up on work. His phone buzzed, and Ethan jumped, not a normal, startled flinch. A full-body jolt, like the vibration had shocked his spine. He snatched the phone up too quickly, thumb swiping the notification away with the urgency of someone putting out a flame. But not before I caught the contact name. Just one letter, V. I felt it in my stomach first. That sudden drop, like your body knows the truth before your brain has the decency to catch up. I kept my face still. I kept breathing like nothing happened. Because if you're married long enough, you learn the difference between reacting and collecting data. Ethan's smile appeared half a second too late. "Sorry," he said lightly. "Just work stuff." I murmured, the way you do when you're trying not to scream. A coincidence, I told myself. People save contacts with letters all the time. V could be Victor, Vanessa, vacation rentals, for all I knew. But Ethan's reaction wasn't about a contact name. It was about being seen. And suddenly my brain started doing what it always does. Pattern recognition. Differential diagnosis. but for my life. Ethan had been working late more often, coming home with explanations so detailed they felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced the script on the drive back. He'd started taking calls in the garage. He'd turned his phone face down on the table, always. 1,000 tiny behaviors that alone mean nothing. Together, they spelled something. I'm trained in evidence-based decision-making. I don't believe in gut feelings without proof. But my gut wasn't whispering. It was pounding its fists against my ribs. Because here was the terrifying equation I couldn't unsee. A patient with a mysterious contact named E. A husband with a mysterious contact named V. And me, stuck in the middle, holding information that could ruin everything. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. Not yet. It was the medical fear. If Victor was seeing someone and hiding his status, that wasn't just unethical. Depending on the circumstances, it could be illegal. It could be dangerous. And if that someone was connected to me, my hands went cold just thinking it. Patient confidentiality is a wall you don't climb. HIPAA isn't a suggestion. It's the spine of our profession. I can't just ask Victor, "Hey, are you sleeping with my husband?" without detonating my career. I can't warn Ethan by saying, "Victor is HIV positive," without violating everything I've sworn to protect. But Victor knows his own status. If he's not disclosing to partners, then my silence becomes a kind of complicity I can't stomach. That night, Ethan's laughter rose at something on his laptop. He looked normal. He looked like the man who used to wrap his arms around me in the kitchen and tell me to prescribe myself a nap. I stared at the TV screen and realized I hadn't absorbed a single word from the show. All I could hear was the click of Victor's phone flipping face down. All I could see was Ethan's thumb swiping away V like it was poison. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Because if I was wrong, I'd torch my marriage for a coincidence. And if I was right, then I was already standing in a fire, and I needed to find out how deep the flames went before I took my next step. That's what I told myself anyway. But later, when Ethan fell asleep beside me, his phone charging on the end table, I lay awake in the dark staring at the ceiling and thinking one terrible thought over and over. What if the truth isn't just that he cheated, but that he never thought I'd find out because he believed I'd be trapped by my own oath? And in that moment, I understood something that made my throat tighten until I could barely swallow. This wasn't just a marriage problem. This was a cage built out of ethics, fear, and love, and I didn't know which bar would cut me first. The next few days moved in a strange, distorted rhythm, like my life was playing at the wrong frame rate. I went to work. I rounded on patients. I discussed blood pressure meds and follow-up scans and lifestyle changes with the same calm cadence I'd used for years. On the outside, I was still Dr. Beatrice Langley, reliable and composed. On the inside, I was cataloging lies. Ethan kissed my cheek goodbye every morning. He still asked what time I'd be home, still complained about traffic, still laughed at the same dumb memes he always had, but his phone never left his hand. He took it into the bathroom, set it face down on the counter, checked it in the middle of conversations, eyes flicking away from mine like he was afraid I'd see something reflected there. I told myself I needed certainty, not suspicion, not intuition, proof. So when Ethan casually mentioned on Saturday afternoon that he was meeting an old college friend for dinner, just drinks and catching up, nothing exciting, I nodded and smiled like a woman who trusted her husband. He left around 6, and he looked wrong. Not bad, not suspicious in an obvious way, just too intentional. Fresh haircut, button-down shirt he usually saved for client meetings, a watch he hadn't worn in months. "Who's the friend again?" I asked lightly, pretending to scroll on my phone. "Mark," he said instantly. Too fast. "You've never met him. We lost touch after graduation." "Where are you going?" "Someplace downtown. I'll text you if we change spots." I kissed him goodbye and closed the door behind him. Then I stood there for a full minute, my hand still on the handle, listening to my own heartbeat thud in my ears like a warning drum. At 7:15, I grabbed my keys. I hated myself the entire drive. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that this was how marriages ended, not with infidelity, but with paranoia. I rehearsed apologies in my head. "I'm sorry I didn't trust you. I'm sorry I projected my stress onto you." I pulled into the parking lot of the restaurant Ethan had named, and his car wasn't there. I circled once, twice. I parked and sat with the engine running, staring through the windshield like if I focused hard enough, reality might rearrange itself. I went inside. The hostess smiled politely when I asked about reservations under Ethan's name. She checked twice, shook her head. "No one by that name tonight." I described him. Tall, dark hair, navy button-down. She frowned apologetically. I would have remembered. I walked back to my car feeling like I'd swallowed broken glass. Maybe they changed venues. Maybe I misheard. Maybe I was officially losing my mind. I sat there for 20 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, telling myself to leave. And then I saw them. They came out of the Marriott lobby 2 blocks down, so casually, so comfortably, like a couple who had done this before and expected to do it again. Ethan was laughing. Not his polite laugh, not his distracted laugh. The real one, the one that used to be mine. Victor walked beside him, close enough that their arms brushed. His hand drifted to Ethan's lower back as they stepped off the curb, familiar and unhesitating. I don't remember unlocking my phone. I remember the camera shaking. I remember my vision narrowing. I remember thinking, absurdly, so this is what confirmation feels like. They stopped by a silver Lexus. Victor said something I couldn't hear. Ethan smiled and leaned in. The kiss wasn't rushed. It wasn't stolen. It was practiced. Long enough that my chest started to ache. Long enough that 7 years of shared mornings and inside jokes and quiet promises collapsed into one humiliating image burned into my retina. I took photos. I hated myself for that too. But I needed them. For the same reason I chart everything. Because memory lies when emotions get loud. I drove home on autopilot and sat in my driveway for nearly 2 hours, hands in my lap, staring at my darkened living room like it belonged to someone else. When Ethan came home at 11:30, he looked relaxed, almost buoyant. "Hey," he said, kicking off his shoes. "You still up?" "Yeah," I replied. My voice sounded normal. That terrified me. He told me about dinner with Mark, about a bar they ended up at, about how good it felt to reconnect. He even showed me a selfie. Bathroom mirror, dim lighting, harmless smile. An alibi. I nodded, asked follow-up questions. Played my role so well I almost convinced myself I was watching someone else perform it. That night he fell asleep in minutes. I lay beside him, eyes open, replaying the kiss in the parking lot over and over until my stomach twisted with nausea. The next few days were worse, because now I knew, and knowing didn't stop the world from moving. Victor showed up at work for an unscheduled visit on Tuesday, complaining about mild side effects from his medication. He sat across from me in the exam room, the same calm, professional distance between us as always. I examined him, adjusted his dosage, maintained perfect bedside manner. Inside, I was screaming. Looking at him, knowing he'd kissed my husband less than 72 hours earlier, felt like dissociating from my own body, like my soul had stepped a few inches to the left just to survive. When the appointment ended, Victor thanked me, smiled, left. And I sat there alone, staring at the empty chair, realizing something irreversible had happened. The lie wasn't just personal anymore. It was medical, ethical, potentially criminal. That was the moment I stopped asking if I should act, and started asking how, without destroying everything before I was ready. I didn't confront Ethan. That was the first decision I made that surprised even me. Instead, I went into risk management mode, the same one I use when a patient's symptoms don't line up, and I need to rule out the worst possibilities before I let myself feel relief. The very next morning, I walked into the employee health clinic at my own hospital and asked for a full STI panel, including HIV. The nurse raised an eyebrow, not judgmental, just curious, but I didn't offer an explanation. I signed the consent forms with a steady hand and sat in the chair, staring at the wall while blood filled the vials. When the rapid HIV test came back negative, I felt a wave of relief so intense my knees almost buckled. But relief isn't resolution. It's just oxygen. I still didn't know how long Ethan and Victor had been seeing each other. I didn't know when exposure might have happened, or how many times my life had unknowingly brushed against danger. So I made another decision. I scheduled routine annual physicals for both Ethan and me. Same day, same time slot. Clean, logical, impossible to argue with. When I suggested it over dinner, he hesitated. "I feel fine," he said. "Do we really need to do all that?" "We're in our mid-30s, I replied evenly. Preventive care isn't optional anymore. I just had a colleague diagnosed with high cholesterol at 34. He had no symptoms. That did it. Ethan nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, sure, you're right." The appointment went exactly how I expected, and worse. He joked with the nurse, answered intake questions casually, sat beside me in the waiting room like a man with nothing to fear. When the blood was drawn, I watched his face. For a fraction of a second, his eyes flicked to mine, and I knew. That night, he was almost affectionate. He asked about my day, offered to cook, laughed easily, like he was trying to cement something before it cracked. For a brief, treacherous moment, I wondered if I'd imagined everything. Then his phone buzzed during dessert, and his face changed. Not panic, not guilt, Something worse. Anticipation. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was reviewing charts in my office. The lab number flashed on the screen. I answered it, already knowing what they were going to say. Dr. Langley, the technician said carefully, I'm calling regarding your husband's test results. I swiveled my chair away from the window, closed my eyes. Go on. There was a reactive result on his HIV screening. Confirmatory testing is underway, but I thanked her and ended the call before she could finish. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at my desk, my mind oddly quiet. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This wasn't betrayal in the abstract. This was diagnosis. I called Ethan and asked him to come to the hospital. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. When he arrived an hour later, I saw it in his face the second he stepped into my office. He already knew. He sat down slowly, hands clasped too tightly, his leg bouncing. B, he said softly, you're scaring me. I placed the lab report between us and turned it so he could read. Your HIV screening came back positive. The room went silent. Ethan stared at the paper like it might rearrange itself if he looked long enough. That's not possible, he whispered. I don't understand. I watched his denial crumble in real time. How could this happen? He asked, tears forming. I don't do drugs. I unlocked my phone, pulled up the photos. The Marriott lobby, the silver Lexus, the kiss. Victor Ramirez, I said evenly. Sound familiar? His face collapsed. Oh my God, he breathed. B, please, I can explain. He's my patient, I cut in, and he's HIV positive, has been for 3 years. Ethan went white. He gripped the edge of the desk like he was about to fall out of the chair. He told me he was clean, Ethan said desperately. He said he got tested all the time. We used protection. Most of the time. Most of the time. I stood up and reached for my prescription pad. That was when Ethan looked at me like I'd become a stranger. What are you doing? I need dates, I said. My voice was flat, clinical. Last sexual contact, frequency, any other partners. Are you serious? He whispered. You're taking notes? Yes. B, please don't treat me like one of your patients. I met his eyes for the first time since he walked in. You are my patient now. The words landed like a slap. He answered my questions between sobs. 3 months. Regular contact. The night he'd lied about dinner with his friend. Every answer felt like another incision. When I finished, I closed the pad and leaned back in my chair. You'll need a specialist, I said. Not me. Will you stay? He begged. I'll end it. I'll do therapy. Anything. I shook my head. You have a chronic, incurable condition because you chose to lie. To me and to yourself. That's not something I can unlearn. He slid out of the chair and dropped to his knees beside my desk, grabbing my hands. Please, he cried, don't leave me alone with this. I pulled my hands away and stood. You weren't alone, I said quietly. You were with Victor. When he asked what I was going to do about Victor, I didn't answer. Because the truth was, I hadn't decided yet. But I knew one thing with terrifying clarity. My marriage was already over. What came next would decide who paid for it. I didn't go home that night. I checked into a hotel 10 minutes from the hospital, the kind with neutral art on the walls and sheets that smell like industrial detergent. I sat on the edge of the bed in my scrubs and stared at my phone while it vibrated itself into exhaustion. Ethan called 9 times, left 4 voicemails, texted apologies that shifted shape every few minutes. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I was lonely. You work all the time. He understood me. Please don't do this. I didn't answer a single one, because the moment I heard his voice again, I knew the doctor in me would soften, and the woman in me would break. The next morning, I met with the hospital's chief medical officer, a representative from legal, and 2 members of the ethics board. The room felt colder than it should have been, like the air conditioning had been calibrated for bad news. I laid out the facts, carefully, clinically, no emotion, no speculation. Victor Ramirez, known HY5 positive, undetectable but aware of status, engaged in a sexual relationship without disclosure, documented evidence, confirmed transmission. No one interrupted me. When I finished, the silence was heavy. Finally, the legal counsel spoke. This constitutes a public health risk that supersedes standard patient confidentiality, she said. But everything must be handled precisely. Court orders, documentation, chain of custody. Translation, do this wrong and you lose your license anyway. Victor was immediately removed from my care and reassigned pending investigation. I was instructed not to contact him directly. All communication would go through administration and legal channels. By noon, I'd also contacted a personal attorney, someone who specialized in physician liability and medical ethics. I listened as he outlined my obligations, my protections, and the possible outcomes. Victor could face criminal charges, up to a decade in prison, depending on how the case unfolded, mandatory contact tracing, public health oversight. I hung up and sat in my car, hands on the steering wheel, wondering how a life collapses so quickly while the sun keeps shining like nothing's changed. That afternoon, Ethan's sister, Clara, called me. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask what happened. She had my shade. Is it true you kicked him out after he got sick? I closed my eyes. He didn't get sick, I said quietly. He lied, and he cheated, and he endangered both of us. There was a pause. Then, people are saying you're being cold. Cold. As if composure were cruelty, as if refusing to drown made me heartless. By the end of the week, the narrative had mutated. Some friends were supportive. My colleague Nina covered my inpatient rounds without being asked. My brother Evan flew in from Denver just to sit with me in silence and order bad takeout. Others weren't subtle. You're a doctor, one mutual friend said. You know HIV isn't a death sentence anymore? Don't you think divorce is extreme? Extreme. Not the cheating, not the lying, not the calculated exposure. My mother surprised me the most. She listened carefully, asked questions, then said, I support you, but don't be shocked if people expect you to be the bigger person. I didn't answer, because I was tired of being expected to absorb damage quietly, just because I had the tools to survive it. Ethan moved in with his ex-girlfriend Lena, a woman from his past who'd always hovered at the edges of our life like a ghost I refused to acknowledge. She offered him support. He accepted. The irony would have been funny if it didn't hurt. The divorce papers were filed 2 weeks later. No kids, no screaming matches over assets, just signatures and the sound of something final clicking into place. I kept the house. He kept his car. We split everything else cleanly. When I signed my name, my hand didn't shake. Victor's case moved forward faster than I expected. He refused to cooperate with contact tracing, hired a defense attorney, denied intent. The evidence didn't care. By the time I took a 6-week leave of absence, I was running on adrenaline and numbness alone. Job offers came in quietly, from Seattle, Austin, Charlotte, colleagues who knew my reputation, who didn't ask questions. Phoenix suddenly felt too small, too loud with memory. On my last night before leave, I stood in my empty living room and realized something that surprised me with its clarity. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. The betrayal didn't define me. The diagnosis didn't destroy me. And the silence from people who should have known better didn't get to write my ending. I packed a suitcase, not to run, but to move forward without waiting for permission. 3 weeks later, the confirmatory test came back. Positive, just as expected. Ethan started treatment immediately under a specialist I helped coordinate, then stepped back from completely. Professionally, I made sure his insurance covered everything and that his transition into care was smooth. Personally, I stopped asking how he was doing. Some lines, once crossed, don't invite follow-up. His response to treatment was strong. Within weeks, his numbers were improving. Medically speaking, his prognosis was good. That fact brought me relief, and nothing else. My own follow-up tests remained negative. I tested again and again. Each result felt like being handed back a future I hadn't realized was dangling over an edge. I started preventative medication, not out of fear, but out of control. I wanted agency over my body again. Victor's situation escalated quietly, the way serious things often do. Court orders, documentation requests, health department involvement. The hospital's legal team handled everything by the book. Victor's refusal to cooperate didn't help his case. The evidence didn't need emotion or narrative. It needed timelines, lab results, proof of knowledge. It had all of that. I was told an investigation was underway. Charges were being considered. I didn't feel satisfaction, only a grim sense of inevitability. Consequences aren't revenge. They're gravity. The divorce finalized on a Friday afternoon. No ceremony, no courtroom drama. Just a judge, 2 signatures, and a sentence that ended 7 years of my life. When I walked out of the building, the sun was blinding. I stood there longer than necessary, blinking into the light, trying to feel something definitive. I didn't. Ethan texted once after that. I hope one day you can forgive me. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't always about absolution. Sometimes it's about release. I took my leave of absence the following Monday. For the first time in over a decade, my calendar was empty. No patient lists, no rounds, no alarms set for 4:30 a.m. I slept, I walked. I let my mind wander without chasing it back to productivity. And then I made a decision. I accepted a position out of state, a clean zip code, a hospital where my name wasn't attached to whispers or headlines or sympathetic looks, a place where I could just be Beatrice Langley, physician, not the woman at the center of a cautionary tale. On my last night in Phoenix, I stood in the doorway of the house I was keeping, the one place that still felt anchored to me, and realized something quietly profound. I didn't lose my marriage the day I found out about the affair. I lost it the moment honesty stopped being mutual. Everything after that was just paperwork. I locked the door, set my suitcase by the car, and drove away without looking back. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I refused to let betrayal be the last thing that defined my life.